Hi there, John Wilkinson, History Made Easier. I've had this book, The Chinese Century, for many, many years now, and I thought I'd use it to support some videos that look at the rise to power of Mao and Mao's China. So we'll see how it works for you. So here's our look at China at the beginning of the 20th century. China had deliberately isolated itself from the rest of the world, and all foreigners and foreign ways were seen as barbaric. The Chinese thought that all roads leading into China were leading from barbaric countries into the only civilized country. Be that as it may, it left China lagging behind the West and vulnerable when the West's interests in China took on a predatory nature. This picture shows peasants crossing a suspension bridge that links China with Tibet. Now here is an incredible statistic, I think. As late as 1950, 85% of China's population were peasants. In Britain, 75% of the population had been living in towns or cities by 1900. Yet 50 years later, 85% of China's population still living in rural communities, still living the life of peasants. And the peasants were desperately poor. To own a water buffalo would make you a wealthy peasant. Water buffaloes were used to pull carts or plough the land, but they were really a luxury. And even using animals to do these physically demanding jobs was beyond the means of most peasants. Here we have a photograph of two peasants raising water to fill their paddy fields simply by pedalling away and cranking up these small buckets of water up to a higher level. And here's a picture of a peasant using the wind and a primitive sail to help push his heavy cart. And a photograph of a peasant carrying his heavy load with the help of the spring of bamboo. He's actually carrying woven straw shoes, by far the most common footwear of peasants. Now, these pictures are not selected pictures that paint a false picture. This was the reality of life for most Chinese peasants. Millions of peasant families supplemented the income from their farm by spinning or weaving cotton and silk. It was something the English peasantry did, but 200 years earlier. And this is a sad photograph. It's a photograph of refugees from the famine-riven countryside on the streets of Shanghai. And throughout the 1920s, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 dead bodies were collected from the streets of Shanghai each year. Such was the depth of poverty. A couple of photographs here showing Chinese market towns. The one on the left is a scene from the gates of Yan'anfu in the southwest of China, and the scene on the right is one of the main streets of the coastal town of Hangzhou. Just to give you a little flavour of that side of Chinese life. Now, the queue. I've got here the ultimate fashion statement for Chinese men. The queue, worn by men, was a long pigtail of plaited hair that was grown behind a shaven forehead, really going right to the centre of the skull. It had been imposed on the Chinese by the Manchus when they conquered China in the 17th century and founded the Qing dynasty. But it did become the height of fashion. Another fashion, foot binding, was introduced in the 11th century. At first, it was confined to the very wealthy before spreading down even to the peasantry. Zhong Chang describes in her book Wild Swans how her grandmother's feet were bound. I'm going to give you just a tiny snippet of what she writes. This is what she says. My grandmother's feet had been bound when she was 2 years old. Her mother, who herself had bound feet, first wound a piece of white cloth about 20 feet long around her feet, bending all the toes except the big toe, inward and under the sole. Then she placed a large stone on top to crush the arch. My grandmother screamed in agony and begged her to stop. Her mother had to stick a cloth in her mouth to gag her. My grandmother passed out repeatedly from the pain. The process lasted several years. Even after the bones had been broken, the feet had to be bound day and night in thick cloth, because the moment they were released, they would try to recover. And she goes on in more detail. But my goodness, what a painful experience. Now, this picture shows would-be mandarins. From the age of 6, boys from elite families would go to lineage schools run by their clan. Now, actually, in this picture, taken around 1900, the West's influence is beginning to show. The dress and the school's furniture is classical Chinese. But look to the left and you'll see very Western-style casement windows. The clan still is at the centre of everything in China, indeed across Southeast Asia. They take on social responsibilities like building granaries or the schools. The clans would also build ancestral halls which would house the spirit tablets of ancestors, to which offerings would be made on the anniversary of the death of an important clan ancestor, or else at funerals or weddings. And it's interesting to note that as late as 1949, there were fewer than 500 surnames in China. And today, according to some estimates, 100 surnames account for 85% of Chinese citizens. For example, there are 92 million Wangs, 91 million Lis, and 86 million Zhangs. Taking a school register must be interesting. Now, punishment during the Qing dynasty would often be carried out in public so as to better serve as a deterrent. In this picture, rebels are being held by their neck in wooden cages. The planks or bricks on which they stood would be removed over several days until they finally choked to death. But this was better than being beheaded, as at least they would meet their ancestors in the afterlife as a whole person. Very important in Chinese culture. Now, I end this presentation with two pictures from the imperial court. This first picture shows the Empress Dowager Cixi being carried by her eunuchs. You will see in the foreground, I hope, an incense burner. The air that the Dowager breathes is improved by these incense burners that are carried before her sedan. Now, Cixi is a very interesting character and important character. She joined the imperial court as a maid in 1852 before becoming the emperor's honourable escort and then becoming the key power behind the throne throughout the last decades of the 19th century and on until her death in 1908. So a very important figure as we look at the decline of the Manchu dynasty, the Qings. And finally, a photograph of the last emperor, Puyi. In this photograph, which was taken in 1911, Puyi was aged 6. But it was Puyi who, in 1932, became the nominal emperor and regent of Manchukuo following the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. So Puyi is the last of the great Chinese emperors, and the Manchus, the last dynasty. So I hope that it was interesting for you. I think China is a country so different in culture from Europe and so difficult for us to comprehend. And I hope these pictures and my brief explanations help you in that and set you up for understanding the collapse of the great Manchu dynasty, the beginning of republicanism in China, and of course set you up for looking at the rise to power of Mao. There's more to come. I'm going to do another video, at least another video before I get to Mao. But I think this is very useful context for you, and I certainly hope you found it so. So, as always, I will say thank you for listening, and as always, I would ask you to check out my History Made Easier website. But for now, cheers.